much, Kay, and I appreciate this opportunity to speak with school leaders. It is not something I often have an opportunity to do since the lockdown, at least not in person or face-to-face. So this has been absolutely fantastic. Let me just check, first of all, are you able to hear me clearly?
Yes, we can hear you clearly and we can see you as well.
Okay, fantastic. So the first thing I just want to say is that, as you probably know, we've just completed a book called Learning Under Lockdown, and it's the perspectives of 400 children from grade R all the way through to grade 12 on their experiences of trying to do learning, whether online or through some low-tech devices, trying to pursue learning in relationship to their teachers and the school. And we were very surprised to get 640 submissions from the 9 provinces. We chose 400, and I read every single one of those stories with my team of editors and selectors. And in the stories of these young people, both from the more established and privileged schools, as well as from the more disadvantaged and poorer schools, and within those very moving stories were some very powerful insights about teaching, but also about leading. In other words, there were messages in there for almost every element or component of the school system, the government department, the education department, sorry, the parents, the teachers, the principals, etc. I want to zero in on what the things are that were either stated directly or inferred from the stories of these incredible young people, and suggest that they were speaking to you as school leaders in some way about how they experienced distance learning. And the first thing I want to mention is that there are very clear indications from these stories about the role, or what the role of the principal should be as an instructional leader. And so over and over in the stories of the students, there is a sense of being overwhelmed with work from the school. Now, this is probably because of the assumption, I think, that teachers might make that, if the students are at home, they probably have free time on their hands. So in the absence of having them in the school, let us load them with schoolwork. That pretty much exhausted the students. That tired them out. That meant that they worked from morning till night, and in several cases, late into the night. And what that implies quite directly for the principal as an instructional leader is the importance of coordinating, of managing, of bringing together teachers and sort of saying, listen, we've got so many learners in their homes. Is there a way that, the physics and the math and the language teacher, etc., could coordinate the work such that it is manageable at the point of use, that is, for the children? And I think this is a really important aspect of leadership that we don't often think about, certainly not in schools, which is how do you manage instruction in a pandemic? And I'm hoping you would find that is useful. By the way, there is a major study that we are doing at the moment about the experiences of women academics under lockdown and the impact on their academic productivity as scholars. And exactly the same thing came up, that the leadership, whether it's the HOD in the chemistry department at university or the HR managers, They have no idea how much work they pile on to people at home. Again, sometimes under the assumption that if you work from home, you are more available. And that blurring of the boundary between work and home then become a fairly major issue, as you can imagine, in the work in the experiences of learners. So I want to underline the importance then of the principal as an instructional leader. The second thing, again, emanating from these stories of learning under lockdown, is the role of the principal as a spiritual leader, as a moral force, as somebody who has pastoral duties. Now, I'm obviously not referring here to any particular sense of religiosity. I'm talking about the fact that everybody is under stress and strain. Everybody is anxious. There's a huge emotional toll that this pandemic takes on teachers, on learners, on school staff in general, on parents, and obviously on the principal as well, and the principal's team, the school management team. But what the role of the leader is in such conditions is to calm people, is to lessen their anxieties, is to give a sense, to convey a sense in a crisis of stability, is to give a sense that things might get better, and they will. And that role, again, of the pastoral duty of the principal is, in my view, something that is underplayed very often in the formal training, if we even do that, of principals in South African schools. So I wanted to bring that to your attention, and this very often, you know, it can be exercised in very simple ways. I mean, I don't know how you exercise your principalship, but just imagine that a principal understood her duty as every single day, just randomly calling the parents of 5 kids in their homes and saying, you know what, I'm the principal of Makiri Primary School. I just called to find out, how are you doing? How's your child doing? What's it like, you know, trying to do some version of schooling at home, because this is certainly not homeschooling, it's schooling at home. And that has a huge impact on people who are stressed and strained by especially the uncertainty around the future and the fear of getting infected, and so on. Again, I doubt the manuals available for principal training anywhere in the world speak about the principal's pastoral duty. Number 3, I would like to speak to you also, again, coming out of these stories, the principal as a mediator among competing forces. I often think of the principal of Heathfield High School in the Cape, and how difficult it must be to be, to stand between the department, who's the employer, the parents who of the children, the one or more unions who have membership in the teaching body, and just the general community. And the principal's role then becomes very clearly one of negotiator, one of reconciling competing and perhaps in some ways irreconcilable positions among different stakeholders. Not so sure that is in the training manual either, the principal as the mediator. And this is an incredible role because of the fear, the ignorance very often, the anxiety among all of these different persons. The department might say, in law, we can tell you when to open and close the school. Parents might say, oh, listen, it's my child, it's my only child, and I'm not going to risk, regardless of what the epidemiologists say, I'm not going to risk my child's health and safety by sending them into a school. So all of these things, of course, become very important in the ways in which principals mediate these conflicts. and so on. I'm certainly hoping, by the way, that post this lockdown, that, you're in Cape Town, they have something I think called the CTI or something like that. I hope that they completely revamp their training modules to take account of these kinds of things that were perhaps not anticipated during normal times. Number 4, I want to speak to you briefly about the principal as the chief communicator in a crisis. Both in our studies of universities, of women academics, and in our study of schools, it is very, very clear that the one thing that stresses parents and teachers more than anything else is garbled communication. It's when the leader and the leadership team sends conflicting messages in the middle of a crisis. Now, to some extent, this is understandable because it is very, very difficult to anticipate, decisions that will be made by the president of the country or by the minister of basic education, because they have to some extent make their decisions based on things like the positivity rate in the particular community and infections among staff in the local school and all of that. Still, one of the key functions of a leader in any context, but especially in the context of schools, is to communicate clearly, is to communicate consistently, is to communicate repeatedly, is to give people a sense, not of long messages, but of 2 or 3 or 4 key messages about what they can expect, about why a policy, a particular action has been taken, and what they might, and how they might handle a particular moment in the crisis. But it's very, very clear you need a communicating officer who, both for the department's communiques, but also for the school-specific set of messages, to play a central role. In the absence of that kind of leadership, in schools and in university, there is chaos. And so this clearly is something that is crucial. Number 5, I want to speak to you about the principal as a resource person in the crisis. I had the privilege of working with Ridwan Samudin from Kanamaya Primary School. I think it's in Grassy Park. Now, what is amazing about Ridwan is that when he realized that with the kids at home in an extended lockdown, he might not be able to pay the governing body teachers and the additional staff that they've appointed. Now, KPS is not a rich school. The little bit of money that they get from parents when the parents are employed and when the kids are in school is enough to sort of, manage from one month to the next. But Ridwan put out a call, and I saw the call, and I called him up and I said, what can we do to help the school? And I think we raised 300 or 400,000, maybe more, from my list of donors, the people I go to when I need money, just to make sure that we can see these staff members through the end of the year. That is the role of the principal. The principal has to be able to look beyond the boundaries of the school fence and say, where do I go for resources? Whose door do I knock on? Who are the people in my networks, assuming you have networks, to be able to help the school in the context of a staffing crisis, among others. And so on. So this puts the principal in the role of an activist, in the role of somebody who goes out, and beyond the department to figure out how to support, in this particular example, the staff of the school. I also want to stretch the envelope here a little bit and talk about the principal as an informed actor in the crisis. That is, as somebody who doesn't just speak because the department said X, Y, and Z is the case, but somebody who can sift through research I had one or two principals that called me up and sort of said, listen, give us the best evidence available at the moment to help us, digest it and make sense of how we can advise parents in our schools, in addition to what the department might require. And I really think we need to be able to do this as part of the training of prospective principals, but also principals on the job. And that is how to consume and make sense of research. Now, of course, the research doesn't always say one thing. As some of you may know, my colleague and friend Nick Spall has a completely different view to me on the opening and reopening of schools, and that is fine. But I think if you as a leader could say, give me the best evidence, Nick, that you have, that that I have, and any other sort of, and let us think through this and sort of ask questions like, are the mitigating factors or measures in place in my school such that I can completely lower the risk of infection given conditions X, Y, and Z? That, I think, is a very important, because certainly the principal in Mitchell's Plain is going to have to make a very different set of calculations from the principal in the elite schools of the southern suburbs. Wherever you are, whatever context you're in my view, it is important to be able to make informed decisions based on evidence available to you and to sift through that in order to speak from a position of authority. And finally, I would like to speak about, in this pandemic, the principal as a source of hope. That is, the leadership of a school, the leadership of a university, the leadership of a private company, the leadership of a state utility. One of the key functions we have as leaders is to give people a sense of hope. There is incredible anxiety out there, as I mentioned earlier, especially among children, but also among teachers. What if my parent is an essential worker and they come home with a virus? What if my spouse is a teacher and I've just had, major surgery, or there are elderly people in the home? I think one of the roles of the principal, apart from the practical issues I mentioned earlier, is to give people a sense that things can and will get better. Because what else do we have if we are only settled with hopelessness as an outcome of this crisis? We will, of course, get out of this crisis. Pandemics come and go. How long they take, of course, is a completely different matter. There will be treatments and there will be vaccines. There will be healing and there will be hope. And that indeed is what I view as the role of any leader, but in particular of the principal of a school. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Jansen. And I think just listening to you and just picking up, some of the key points in terms of both from the, the voices of South African children and the stories learning under lockdown, and realizing that even from their voices, how instrumental our school principals are to really assume this position of a directive role during this time, and also ensuring that with that directive role, the messaging is very consistent, as so not to create more panic, but rather to bring in a sense of ease into the school environment and be realistic about what is possible within that school environment, whilst at the same time also being transparent and succinct with the information that people are receiving. So I think that's quite valuable. We're going to just open up for a Q&A session now. So I'd like my colleagues that are supporting me with the technical just to let me know if there's any questions, or if anybody would like to speak and not just necessarily put it in the chat, but would like to ask Professor Jansen any questions directly. This is your opportunity and your time to do so. I see we've got Bongiwe Langa that's raised their hand. You're welcome to ask your question to the professor.
Afternoon, Professor, and everyone that's part of the session. This is a great session indeed, I must say. It's like you are speaking to me personally. I'm part of the SPB committee for a school in Johannesburg, and we are just about to lose educators. So when you spoke of the resources, it was like you just hit it on the nail. Because as it is, the learners are battling with adaptation to this new normal that we are all have to adapt to in a short period of time. And now having to lose the teachers, it means that even the stability, even if the education will opt bringing new teachers, as it's been said by the education that they'll be giving schools needs to apply for temporary teachers that will come on a temporary basis. But what about the stability of the learners? Because you are bringing somebody new who has never been in class, who have never taught, and this person needs to then start to adapt to teach. So have they looked at the adaptation also and the stability of the learners? It's a concern. I'm not saying that it's not a good idea to give people jobs, but I was thinking in an aspect that they should have at least considered that to say, how can we assist the school so that it has a balance? We will bring and add over and above and so much swallow those ones that the school unable to pay for on a monthly basis, so that the kids can have that flow of stability. So I don't know, Professor, is there any advice that you could give us? I would really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bongewe. I completely agree with you. I think the one very negative consequence of the lockdown is that, of course, a number of teachers, particularly those with comorbidities, have to remain at home. And this creates a staffing nightmare for any principal, whether primary school or high school, because those teachers have to eventually be, replaced and so on. And I always think it's foolish to think that whether it's primary or high school, that you can simply take a teacher from, with one specialization and put them into a class with another to teach in another area. I regard myself as a fairly good biology teacher, as they used to call it, life sciences. But you put me in a physics class, and I can teach it, but it's going to take me 100 times more longer preparation. And I'm not even talking about the languages, which I know nothing about. So when you then bring somebody in from the outside, this is even under normal circumstances, pre-pandemic times, as many of you know, this is extremely difficult for children to simply latch on to another teacher, and especially so in the younger, with the younger children. So these are things that need to be managed very carefully. I don't think it's something we can completely avoid, but I do think it is crucial to ease both the staff as a whole, but also the children into, to get used to these new circumstances. Look, the reality is, and even I have to admit that, we're going to have to learn to live with this virus for a while. It is coronavirus, it's a novel virus. It will, maybe like the flu virus, stay with us for some time to come. And if that is the case, then this kind of unpredictability in staffing and the impact on especially children is something we will have to manage at the school level in a way that is not as disruptive as simply placing a new stranger into the place of a familiar teacher. So that again is a management challenge. Thanks, Bongi.
Thanks, Professor Jansen. And I guess it goes back to the point that you spoke about around principals really are now in a position where they have to look beyond, what the norm was, and really expand in terms of their thinking and the boundaries, and really, be creative in their own leadership styles to be able to address some of these challenges without compromising education for the children. Professor, we do have another question from Brian Wilson, and he'd really like you to expand on the mentoring role of the principal and leader during this time.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Look, I think it's very difficult to start mentoring in a pandemic when you haven't been mentoring as a practice before the pandemic. You know, in other words, if it's not a habit of leadership. Nonetheless, I think it is very, very important. I've been in touch recently because of the lockdown book with several younger teachers, newer teachers. And, you know, I was incredibly encouraged by their energy, despite the fact that they teach in poorer schools, by their enthusiasm, by their willingness to be mentored. So I'm mentoring a bunch of these young teachers. But the best people to mentor is actually the people in the school management team, the people, the principal, him or herself. And so I think that kind of mentorship needs to take care of at least the following areas. First of all, it has to take care of the person's competence in the subject matter. Most of what I learned about teaching, I didn't learn in university, I can assure you. I learned it from mentors, people who were out, I can give you their names, are outstanding teachers of my subject. So there's that. Secondly, there's mentorship at the level of confidence, the level of classroom-based leadership, the level of how to manage a classroom, which is not necessarily subject influence. That is something in which experienced principal leaders can play a huge role. And thirdly, it is mentorship in the context of character. You know, what do you do when there's a crisis? What do you do when everybody around you is falling flat? I'm thinking of a young teacher that I'm mentoring in Mitchell's Plain, Theola Phillips, who says, you know, when I get into that classroom, I'm feeling down. I'm scared for my own children, but I've got to put on my game face. I've got to be there for them. I've got to give the impression, at least, that I am together. That's not something most young teachers do automatically. That is something that comes from observing leadership. And so that's my last point, Brian, on this particular issue, that the best way in which to mentor is to mentor through the power of your example as a leader. You know, when I was a university principal, the one thing that I was always aware of was that there were 27,000 at one stage students who watched my every move, okay? And my relationships with the staff, my relationships with white people, my relationships with the business community, my relationship with the kids, the children, the students themselves, was a way in which they learned about how to be as young people. That doesn't come through a workshop. It doesn't come through a training, manual. And so I still think that the most powerful, when I think of Ernie Steenveld, for example, who was the demoted, deputy principal at Trafalgar High School. He never once gave me a lecture on anything as a young teacher, but I can tell you now, almost everything I do today is just from observing the guy they called Snooky, just observing this utter consummate professional, etc. Don't undercount modeling as a form of mentorship.
Absolutely. Thanks, Professor. We've got Janine Buerta, and Janine, we'll wrap up with your question as the last question for Professor Jansen. I see we're slightly over time, so I want to then move on to our next keynote speaker. So Janine, welcome, and you're most welcome to ask the Professor your question.
Thank you. My question will be, if you obviously mentioned what a good principal can be. If, for example, I've got a learner staying with me that's in grade 12 this year, but the principal is not any of these 6 principals that you spoke about now. So how, as a parent, can I bring influence to the school, or how can I stir that in order for that principal, I don't know, to be, even just to think beyond himself and actually be setting a good example for even the teachers in his school. So that's coming from a parent's perspective, as per se.
Right. No, thank you very much. It's very difficult. It depends on how receptive a principal is to outside advice. So let's just be honest with each other. There are principals whose attitude will be, sadly, who are you to tell me how to do my job? You're just a parent. You know, I'm in charge of the school. When you have somebody like that, then the chances of having a positive influence is very limited, I'm afraid. On the other hand, I do know principals who are democratic in their practice, who are humble in their leadership, who are open to ideas, who would say, you know what, the more the merrier, bring me the best ideas. When I'm looking at the gallery view here, and I'm thinking of people like Brandon Paulsers on the line, whom I know well. I think it's Andre Lamprecht and so on. I mean, these are the kinds of principals I know that if you went to them with a good idea, they would listen to you. So I would say to a parent, do an assessment, first of all, is this the kind of principal you can approach directly, and will your ideas be well received? If that is not the case, I would sort of say, you know what, maybe I will write a letter to the governing body and sort of say, I have concerns X, Y, and Z. Is this something that you might want to take care of? Approach is everything. Don't go in waving an accusatory finger, because people tend to get ticked off fairly quickly. But present in such a way that you can have at least an optimal response to a concern. But maybe it's the deputy principal, maybe it's a senior teacher, as I said, maybe it's the governing body. But first make a judgment as to whether this is the kind of leadership that will take you seriously and listen to your ideas. But there's always a way in. There's always a way in to influence leadership for the good.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Jansen. And we can only give you our absolute gratitude for being with us this afternoon, and really sharing your insightful experience and knowledge, vast experience and knowledge and depth with our audience this afternoon. So thank you very much. And we know that you might not be able to stay, but we hope that you can for a little bit longer in case there's any other questions. But thank you very much, Professor Jansen.
Thanks, Kay. Bye, everyone.